In 1955, Billie Holiday made the biggest mistake of her life. She borrowed $50,000 from the New York Mafia. That money was worth over $500,000 in today's currency, and it was clear that Lady Day would never be able to pay it back. But the Mafia wasn't patient. First came the polite warnings, then the threats began, and finally Billie Holiday's life turned into absolute hell. No one came to her performances because club owners were scared. Record companies refused to work with her, and every night when she went home, she could hear footsteps following behind her. Even on that final night of July 17th, 1959, at Metropolitan Hospital, Mafia men were still there. So did Lady Day really die of natural causes? Or because the mysterious details surrounding Billie Holiday's death will shock you. On a hot summer night in 1955, in the back room of a small restaurant in Manhattan's Little Italy, jazz music's brightest star, Billie Holiday, sat face to face with one of New York's most dangerous men, Tony Benedetto, owner of a club chain partnered with the Vito Genovese family, was making Lady Day an attractive offer. $50,000 upfront payment for a 3-month exclusive performance series at Cotton Club. This amount was twice Billie's annual income at the time, and it was enough to break Lady Day's resistance. However, the true nature of this deal was much darker. Benedetto had told Billie he was lending her money, but actually he was holding Lady Day's voice and body as collateral against this money. In the fine print of the agreement, it stated that if the money wasn't paid on time, all of Billie Holiday's performance rights would transfer to the Mafia. Even worse, this agreement made Billie not just financially, but physically the property of the Mafia. Lady Day didn't understand this that night, but she would learn soon enough. 3 months later, the promised performances at Cotton Club had been a great success. However, the club's revenue had fallen far short of expectations because Benedetto had deliberately kept ticket prices extremely high. The goal wasn't to make money, but to trap Billie. In the last week of September, Lady Day's manager Joe Glazer delivered the terrible news. The 3-month performance series had generated less income than expected, and only $15,000 of the $50,000 debt could be paid. The remaining $35,000, along with interest, was still on the Mafia's books. In the first week of October 1955, 2 men appeared at Billie Holiday's door in Harlem. Dressed in handsome suits and gentlemanlike in appearance, these men introduced themselves as Mr. Benedetto's financial advisors. In a polite but determined tone, they said they wanted to have a small conversation with Lady Day about the debt. Billie's boyfriend at the time, John Simmons, was home and understood the seriousness of the situation, refusing to leave the woman alone. However, the visitors smiled and said, "This is a private financial matter, we need to speak only with Miss Holiday," and entered despite John's objections. That first conversation in the living room was one of the turning points in Billie Holiday's life. The men explained that the debt wasn't just about money. "Mr. Benedetto trusts you very much and expects you not to disappoint that trust," added the tall one among them. "If you have problems with the payment plan, maybe you can settle the debt in other ways." After these words, they placed photographs on the table that had been taken at other clubs Billie had never seen. Lady Day appeared in these photos with other singers, but she didn't recognize any of these women. "These ladies were in the same situation as you," said one of the men. "Now they all work for Mr. Benedetto." Before the visitors left, they made a payment plan proposal to Billie. Monthly payments of $5,000 could close the debt in 7 months. However, this amount was almost all of Lady Day's monthly income at the time. "Of course there are other options too," said the short man as he left. "Mr. Benedetto is a very understanding businessman. We can find suitable solutions for you." Billie couldn't fully grasp the extent of the threat hidden behind these words at that moment. But soon everything would become much clearer. In November 1955, as the first payment date approached, the atmosphere around Billie Holiday began to change. First came small things: empty phone calls, midnight doorbell sounds, unknown cars waiting in front of her house. Then things got more serious. The owner of Blue Note Club, where Lady Day regularly performed, called Billie one morning to say he had to cancel the 3-night performance planned for that week. The reason wasn't clear, but the tension in the club owner's voice said everything. That same week, an unexpected call came from Billie's record company, Columbia Records. The company's production manager announced that the planned recording sessions were postponed for technical reasons. These technical reasons were actually the result of Tony Benedetto's conversations with Columbia's upper management. The Mafia had spoken not only to club owners, but also to the heart of the record industry. The message was clear: doing business with Billie Holiday meant having problems with the Benedetto family. At the beginning of December, the situation had become undeniable. Billie Holiday's downstairs neighbor complained about the strange men visiting Lady Day. These men didn't look like normal visitors. They always came at the same times, waited for long periods, and sometimes stood in front of the apartment even when Billie wasn't there. The apartment manager was worried because other tenants were also starting to get uncomfortable. However, he didn't dare explain this situation to Lady Day, because now everyone understood that Billie Holiday was having problems with the wrong people. Worst of all, this pressure began to affect Billie's artistic performance as well. When she took the stage, her hands trembled, her vocal tone wasn't at its former strength, and sometimes she would freeze in the middle of songs. Audiences noticed this change in Lady Day, but had no idea about the reason. Billie, meanwhile, would sit in the dressing room for hours after each performance, not daring to go outside, because now she felt that on every street corner there was someone waiting for her. At the beginning of 1956, Billie Holiday's financial situation had turned into a complete disaster. Because the debt to the Mafia couldn't be paid, it had risen to $45,000 with interest. Moreover, due to performance bans, Lady Day's income sources had almost completely dried up. None of the major clubs in New York dared to work with her. Record companies postponed recording sessions indefinitely. Even Billie's manager Joe Glaser was starting to distance himself from Lady Day, because threatening phone calls were also coming for Glaser's other clients. In this situation, Tony Benedetto made Billie a generous offer. In exchange for erasing the debt, Lady Day would work only at clubs controlled by Benedetto for 3 years. This agreement offered Billie a guaranteed weekly income of $500, which was a reasonable amount for that time. However, the secret clauses of the agreement were much darker. Billie would submit her performance repertoire to the Mafia's approval. They would choose her stage costumes, and she would even have to submit decisions in her private life to the financial advisor's opinion. Even worse, this agreement essentially made Billie Holiday Mafia property. Lady Day couldn't leave this agreement whenever she wanted, couldn't work at other clubs, and even had to get permission when leaving the city. Benedetto's lawyers had presented this agreement as a special artist management contract, but in reality, it was a slavery contract experienced in the mid-20th century. Billie thought she had no choice but to sign this agreement because the alternative was putting her life at risk. When the agreement was signed in February 1956, Billie Holiday ceased to be a free artist. She was no longer Lady Day, but an object controlled by the Mafia. In the first weeks, the situation seemed normal because working at Benedetto's clubs at least allowed her to continue stage performances. However, she would soon understand how different everything was. Because this agreement was just the beginning, and the real horrific plans hadn't been implemented yet. The Mafia's strategy for controlling Billie Holiday wasn't limited to financial pressure. Tony Benedetto and his team began systematically isolating Lady Day from her social circle. The first target was Billie's closest friends. Her colleagues in the jazz world were warned with mysterious phone calls and advised not to meet with Lady Day. These suggestions were polite but contained clear threats. "Miss Holiday is going through a special situation right now. It would be good if you didn't spend too much time with her." Duke Ellington was one of Billie's oldest friends and initially didn't care about these threats. However, in March 1956, a special concert planned to be held at Duke's own club was canceled without any explanation. The club owner said he postponed the event due to security concerns, but the real reason was obvious. Duke Ellington was going to share the stage with Billie Holiday that night, and the Mafia wasn't allowing it. After this incident, Duke stopped calling Lady Day. What he lost wasn't just a friend, but also a source of musical inspiration. Ella Fitzgerald's situation was even more tragic. Ella and Billie were the two great female voices of the jazz world, and had been supporting each other for years. However, in April 1956, Illa's manager announced with an unexpected phone call that Ella had to cut all professional ties with Billie. "This isn't a personal decision, it's a business security matter," he added. Ella wanted to rebel against this situation, but didn't dare risk her own career. The friendship between the two women was crushed under the dirty hands of the Mafia. The most painful separation was with John Simmons. Billie's boyfriend John was initially determined to stand by Lady Day. However, in May 1956, John's own music career began to be targeted. He was kicked out of the group where he played guitar, planned recording sessions were canceled, and problems even started to arise in the apartment where he lived. John, unable to withstand this pressure, decided to leave Billie. "This isn't my fault, but I can't protect you anymore," He wrote in his farewell letter. Lady Day was now completely alone, and this isolation was the most critical phase of the Mafia's plan. From the summer of 1956 onwards, Billie Holiday's stage performances were no longer under her control. Tony Benedetto's financial advisors determined what Lady Day would sing, how she would dress, and even how she would behave. This control was so detailed that everything from Billie's stage makeup to her costumes, from song order to performance duration, was planned in advance. Lady Day was no longer an artist, but a puppet directed by the Mafia. The most traumatic change was repertoire control. Strange Fruit, one of Billie Holiday's most famous songs, was removed from the programs. This song was known for its anti-racism message, and the Mafia didn't allow Lady Day to sing such political songs. Instead, Billie was forced to sing love songs and light jazz pieces chosen by the Mafia. Even worse, the audience profile at Benedetto's clubs had changed. Jazz lovers who used to come to listen to Billie were replaced by Mafia-connected businessmen and their guests. These new audiences saw Lady Day not as a music icon, but as an entertainment element controlled by the Mafia. During performances, disrespectful comments were made. Sometimes special songs were requested from Billie in the middle of the stage, and Lady Day had no right to refuse. In August 1956, the most painful example of the situation occurred. A special night was organized at Benedetto's club in the Bronx, and Billie Holiday had to perform only for specific people that night. There was no one she knew among the audience, but it was clear that they all had Mafia connections. That night, Lady Day was asked not only for her normal songs but also for personal performances. Billie Holiday, crying in the dressing room after the show, realized that she was now not only financially, but also humanly a prisoner of the Mafia. Freedom had become just a fantasy. At the beginning of 1957, Billie Holiday's Mafia debt had never decreased because Benedetto was systematically adding new expenses. Security fees for club performances, procurement costs for special costumes, and even protection services for the hotels where Lady Day stayed constantly increased the debt. During this period, a new element entered Billie's life: heroin. And this wasn't a coincidence. The most sinister aspect of Tony Benedetto's strategy was to keep Billie Holiday under control by making her a drug addict. Mild sedatives initially suggested for performance stress gradually turned into stronger substances. The Mafia's doctor connections offered Lady Day special treatment, and the main component of this treatment was heroin. Billie initially resisted, but constant pressure, isolation, and despair led her into this trap. Heroin addiction perfected the Mafia's control over Billie. Now Lady Day was not only financially, but also physically dependent on the Mafia. Drug supply was provided through channels controlled by Benedetto, which meant Billie could never truly escape. The need for heroin kept her constantly with the Mafia, and this addiction began to destroy both Lady Day's physical and mental health over time. Interestingly, during this period, Billie Holiday's performance quality experienced a paradox. On one hand, drug use was damaging her voice and coordination, but on the other hand, the pain and despair she experienced added an emotional intensity to her songs that had never existed before. Audiences noticed this authentic pain in Lady Day's performances and appreciated it even more. Ironically, Billie's artistic peak coincided with the period of her personal collapse. The Mafia used this situation to their advantage, beginning to market Billie Holiday as the authentic jazz tragedy queen. Lady Day's pain became an entertainment product sold at premium prices in Benedetto's clubs. Audiences came not only to listen to music, but also to witness a real tragedy. This situation completely blurred the line between art and exploitation. At the beginning of 1958, Billie Holiday's situation took an unexpected dimension. The FBI detected Lady Day's heroin use and Mafia connections. However, the FBI's purpose wasn't to save Billie, but to use her against both the Mafia and federal authorities. In this situation, Lady Day was caught between two fires: Mafia threats on one side and FBI pressure on the other. Anslinger's plan was to convince Lady Day to provide information about the Mafia and thus bring down both drug operations and organized crime networks. However, this plan made Billie's life even more dangerous because the Mafia wouldn't forgive anyone who cooperated with the FBI. While Billie Holiday remained in this dilemma, pressure from both the Mafia and FBI became unbearable. While the Mafia kept her under constant control, the FBI also conducted regular interrogations and surveillance operations. Lady Day had now lost not only her artistic identity, but also her personal security. Every day she didn't know who posed a greater threat, the Mafia or the FBI. During this period, Billie's performances were also affected. While on stage, she constantly wondered whether there were FBI agents or Mafia men among the audience. Her paranoia had increased so much that sometimes she would freeze in the middle of a performance, forget the song, and have to leave the stage. Audiences attributed these situations to Lady Day's artistic temperament, but the reality was much darker. By the summer of 1959, Billie Holiday's health condition had reached a critical level. Years of heroin addiction, chronic stress, and malnutrition had destroyed Lady Day's liver. However, both the Mafia and FBI wouldn't leave Billie alone even during her fatal illness. Both sides were trying to benefit from Lady Day until the last minute. During her final days at Metropolitan Hospital, there were constantly people waiting outside Billie Holiday's room. Officially identified as family, friends, and federal agents, these people actually represented both the Mafia and FBI. The Mafia wanted to know whether Lady Day had spoken to federal agents before dying. The FBI was trying to get last-minute confessions from Billie. On the night of July 16th, when Billie Holiday's condition worsened, the tension in the hospital room peaked. Mafia representatives were trying to prevent FBI agents from being alone with Lady Day. The FBI claimed that Mafia men were threatening Billie. This absurd situation showed that even the final hours of a terminally ill woman were being politicized. When Billie Holiday took her last breath at 3:10 a.m. on July 17, 1959, there were still people waiting outside the hospital room. Even after Lady Day's death, both the Mafia and FBI tried to find her personal belongings and possible secret records. Billie Holiday's death was from natural causes, but the process leading to this situation was definitely not natural. In the fall of 1957, an unexpected complication was added to Billie Holiday's life. Tony Benedetto's 23-year-old son Michael had begun regularly watching Lady Day at his father's clubs. Michael wasn't involved in Mafia business like his father. He was studying law at Columbia University and was passionately devoted to jazz music. However, his interest in Billie Holiday wasn't just musical. Michael Benedetto began coming to Lady Day's dressing room after her performances. Initially, these visits were under the pretext of conveying his father's greetings, but over time the young man's true intentions became clear. Michael had fallen in love with Billie and wasn't trying to hide this love. For Lady Day, this situation was both dangerous and ironic. The son of the Mafia leader who enslaved her had romantic feelings for her. This forbidden relationship created great tension within the Mafia family. Tony Benedetto saw his son's relationship with his property as a great disrespect. Because in Benedetto's eyes, Billie Holiday wasn't a human being but an asset with economic value. Michael's love for Lady Day was a direct challenge to his father's authority. This topic was frequently discussed in family meetings, and Michael was warned not to disrupt the family's business structure. However, young Michael's stubbornness made the situation even more complicated. He began sending expensive gifts to Billie Holiday and even offered to pay off her debt. These offers infuriated Tony Benedetto because his son was trying to disrupt family business. Benedetto threatened to distance his son from the family, but Michael wouldn't back down. In this situation, Lady Day was caught in the middle of a power struggle between the Mafia father and son. The most critical moment occurred in November 1957. Michael came to Billie Holiday's room without his father and offered to run away together. "We can go to California. No one can find you there," said the young man. However, Billie knew how dangerous this offer was. If she tried to escape with Michael, Tony Benedetto would not only kill her, but also punish his own son. Lady Day understood that this forbidden love would bring disaster to all parties. At the beginning of 1959, as Billie Holiday's health rapidly deteriorated, the Mafia implemented one final manipulation plan. Tony Benedetto announced that he wanted to take care of Lady Day's hospital expenses. Behind this gesture was the desire to keep Billie under control until her death. Because in the hospital environment, Lady Day would be protected from both the FBI and Mafia enemies. The management of Metropolitan Hospital had initially accepted Tony Benedetto's philanthropy offer. After all, treatment costs were high, and there was no one to pay. However, what the hospital didn't know was that Benedetto could completely control Lady Day's environment this way. Now the people who would visit Billie, the doctors who would enter the hospital, and even the medicines to be used were under mafia control. The most surprising development during this period was Michael Benedetto's regular visits to the hospital. The young man was coming to see Billie Holiday without his father's permission, and this situation was disturbing the hospital staff. Because in the same corridors, Michael, FBI agents, and mafia guards were all walking around. The hospital had become a battlefield where different forces were struggling. Kaminer was Billie Holiday's doctor and was helpless in the face of this complex situation. On one hand, there were his patients' real treatment needs, while on the other hand, there were constantly interfering external forces. The mafia wanted to control the medicines Billie received. The FBI was trying to record Lady Day's statements. Michael continued to declare his love. This chaotic environment made Billie's final days even more painful. In the first weeks of July 1959, the situation reached a critical level. Billie Holiday's room was no longer a hospital room, but had become a political arena where different interests clashed. Even during Lady Day's final breaths, the power struggle around her continued. This situation was the most painful example of how an artist could lose her human value and be turned into a strategic asset. During Billie Holiday's final days in the hospital, FBI agent Harry Anslinger had secret audio recordings made. These recordings contained Lady Day's statements about the mafia, which included critical evidence for the FBI's organized crime operations. However, these recordings mysteriously disappeared immediately after Billie's death. Only coded references to these recordings exist in FBI archives. There are only indirect clues about the content of the lost recordings. According to Anslinger's reports, Billie Holiday had revealed that the mafia controlled not only her, but other artists using the same methods. Lady Day's statements included details that the entire New York jazz scene in the 1950s was manipulated by organized crime organizations. This information was of a nature that could rewrite the history of the music industry. The most striking claim was that the mafia conducted a cleanup operation during Billie Holiday's final days. Tony Benedetto had initiated a systematic evidence destruction campaign to prevent potential leaks before Lady Day's death. Within this scope, not only FBI records but also Billie's personal letters, diaries, and even photographs disappeared. The goal was to erase all traces of Lady Day's relationship with the mafia. Michael Benedetto's role in this process is still unclear. Some sources claim that the young man opposed his father's cleanup operation and tried to protect Billie's personal belongings. Other sources suggest that Michael eventually supported his father's plan, unable to withstand family pressure. Whatever the truth, these lost recordings remain one of the biggest mysteries in Billie Holiday's story. 6 months after Billie Holiday's death, Tony Benedetto's mafia empire experienced an unexpected collapse. This collapse is thought to be directly connected to Billie's story. Because Lady Day's death had accelerated the FBI's operations against the Benedetto family, Anslinger began using the secret statements he had obtained from Billie against Benedetto. In the spring of 1960, Benedetto's club chain was closed with sudden raids. The detailed information the FBI used in these operations was the kind of insider tips only Billie Holiday could have provided. Information about the club's financial records, secret room arrangements, and even staff tricks was so specific that only someone who had worked in this environment for years could know it. Lady Day had taken revenge against the mafia, even after her death. Tony Benedetto's arrest process went through dramatic developments. The FBI targeted Benedetto with charges of systematic abuse that caused Lady Day's death. This case was one of the first to legally address the mafia's control over artists. Benedetto's lawyers argued that their client had only established normal commercial relationships, but the evidence showed otherwise. The most ironic development was Michael Benedetto's agreement to testify for the FBI. The young man openly stated that what his father did to Billie Holiday was inhumane and expressed his emotional connection with Lady Day in court. Michael's testimony was the blow that ended his father's mafia career. While the Benedetto family was falling apart internally, Billie Holiday's spirit seemed to have finally found peace. After the Billie Holiday incident, the New York jazz scene was never the same again. The FBI's mafia operations had revealed the secret power balances in the music industry. Dozens of clubs closed, countless clean-looking businessmen's dirty connections were exposed. Lady Day's tragic story played a catalyst role in the transformation of the music world. As the civil rights movement gained strength in the 1960s, Billie Holiday's story became a source of inspiration. The banning of the song Strange Fruit and the pain Lady Day suffered because of it became one of the symbols of the anti-racism struggle. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned Billie Holiday in his famous 1963 speech, emphasizing the price Lady Day paid for freedom. The legal structure of the music industry also underwent fundamental changes. New laws were enacted regarding artist rights, contract conditions were regulated, and predatory practices became a legal crime category. Most of these changes were designed to prevent the abuse Billie Holiday experienced from happening again. Lady Day's pain was transformed into a protective shield for future generations of artists. However, the most important change was the awareness of artists. Billie Holiday's story taught musicians to be more careful with their business associates. Young artists learned to recognize the traps Lady Day experienced and protect themselves. In this respect, Billie Holiday's legacy was not only musical, but also a contribution to social justice. Despite 6 decades passing since Billie Holiday's death, the power dynamics in the music industry haven't completely changed. Today, young artists can still face similar manipulations under the names of creative constraints, special deals, and protection services. What Lady Day experienced isn't just a story from the past, but also warning signs for today. In the modern music industry, concepts like 360-degree deals, exclusive management contracts, and image rights are actually updated versions of the control mechanisms Billie Holiday experienced. Artists still face risks of financial dependency, social isolation, and identity manipulation. Lady Day's story provides a critical guide for recognizing these risks. In the social media age, concepts of artists' branding and personal brand management are different forms of the identity control Billie Holiday experienced. Today's artists can lose control not only over their musical talents, but also their personal lives, political views, and even emotional states. This situation is the modern version of the performance slavery Lady Day experienced. The most striking parallel is seen in addiction control. In the 1950s, heroin was the tool the mafia used to control artists. Today, social media addiction, constant performance pressure, and identity crisis can produce similar results. While artists are being manipulated by digital platforms' algorithms, they can experience the psychological pressure Billie Holiday went through. Billie Holiday's story isn't just a dark page in music history, but also a vital lesson for today's artists. Lady Day's $50,000 mafia debt continues today in the form of million-dollar creative constraints. Technology and business models change, but human nature and the lust for power remain unchanged. Billie Holiday's pain continues to be with us to understand the past and protect the future.